Can you hear me back there? All right, I can't stay here. I'm too hyper right now. I'm too nervous. So I'm going to need to move around. I'm Carlos Tejeda. I'm a professor here at the Charter College of Education, California State University, Los Angeles. I want to begin with some acknowledgments and an apology, a very deep felt apology. I feel terrible right now. But let me begin with the acknowledgments. And the first is that since I'm going to be highlighting some of what colonialism has done to us and just making the case that we really need to keep that in the front of our heads, not in the back of our heads, as we're thinking about urban education, we often forget, and I know I'm guilty of this all the time, the resistance that has gone on from the very beginning of colonialism. And that resistance has opened up spaces that we now occupy. I as a professor and you as people that get to be here instead of picking somebody's fruit on a Saturday morning. Right? So I want to acknowledge that because it's opened up these spaces, and oftentimes we forget that we're connected to the past, not only in the forms of domination that make us, but also in the forms of resistance against that domination. So that's the first acknowledgement. And along with that acknowledgement of those people, I want to acknowledge my parents, because at a very ontogenetic, the level of my history from the day I came out of my mother's womb, two human beings who were exiles from equality in this place they called Mexico struggled for me to be here. So at a very personal level, my ability to be here today is about what those people had to go to. Right? I lost my dad a year ago, and that has profoundly affected the way I think about the past, the present, and the future in a lot of different ways. I also want to acknowledge the people that put this conference together. This is the first one of this type that I get the privilege of speaking at as a keynote speaker, and I want to thank them for that invitation. I think that this is a concrete manifestation of those hundreds of years of resistance and struggle against colonialism. This is a space that's happening today, so I want to acknowledge that. And now the apology. I was sitting back there and I had a coffee, which I haven't drank in a while because it's not healthy for me. And I had to go to the restroom really bad. And this is when the group was dancing. And it didn't dawn on me until I was walking right through the front and they were in the middle of doing something, that I was walking through a ceremony. And I felt horrible on the walk over to the restroom because I realized I would never walk through the front of an altar at a Catholic church while the priest is giving communion, even though I'm not Catholic anymore. Right? But I feel bad because, and I realized how difficult it is to deal with colonialism at the everyday level, that I'm very disconnected from what was going on here. I don't understand the Aztec dancers, even though I know I have a lineage to those people, right? And that says something about what colonialism has done to us in fragmenting us, right? And there's another apology that's coming up front on one of the slides in relation to that. So I wanted to highlight that to you for two reasons. That as I speak to you, I want to make sure that it's crystal clear that everything I talk about up here, I'm guilty of too. That I embody all the complicity with colonialism that I make reference tonight, with my own actions and my own ignorance. And the other point I want to make is, well, let me skip that because I'm going to go off on a tangent. I'm just going to get into this, okay? And start off by saying this. I'm going to be all over the place if I don't stick to what I put on these slides. The other point I really want to make, given what happened earlier today, is that I don't have things that I'm going to propose as solutions or answers or the way to see things. These are merely, honestly, ideas. And I want you to see anything I say from up here as if I were sitting at a table with you and we were trying to put together a way to resist colonialism more effectively. These would simply be the ideas I would put forth, up for debate, to be contested, and to be modified. I don't have answers. I'm very humbled by the difference I see in this room. People coming from different places, struggling in different ways. I'm an academic, I'm a scholar, I'm to a large extent a European man inside an Indian body. Because I have been so deculturalized, so detribalized, that I don't understand what the Aztec dancers were doing. And that says a lot. So I really want to humble what I'm going to say, because oftentimes I use my voice in a way that seems like I speak with an authority, and I don't profess to have it. Okay? These are just some of the things I want to get through, to try to get through, and I know I'm not going to. And these are things I think we need to think about as we're thinking about urban education. I'm not going to speak too profoundly about urban education because I'm still really confused about what it is. I know Beverly Hills and Palos Verdes are in urban Los Angeles. So what I want to speak about is any four things that I think we need to think about when we're resisting any form of colonialism. And I think the very use of the term urban is one of those things that colonialism has taught us about how to use language to disguise realities. Because I think it's more appropriate, perhaps, to say, instead of saying colonialism and urban education, colonialism and the education for dominated peoples, I think, would be a more appropriate way, right? So that's I want to focus and really try to think through our genealogies of corporal, genocide, and cultural holocaust, the continuance of colonialism in contemporary context, the continuance of colonialism in the educational, the need for anti-colonial notions of social justice. Simultaneously, the fact that I think we should be working simultaneously for two things: the development of a critical consciousness and academic literacies at the same time. The fundamentality of praxis and the need to work from what I refer to as a theoretical heteroglossia, and finally, acknowledging our inextricability, and that means our complicity in colonialism and the way it works today. God, I feel like I'm in a marathon racing. 25 minutes. Okay, I just want to highlight these two books, and the other thing I should say as I go on is that as I speak today, a lot of people speak through me. Everything I say today is heteroglossic in the sense that what I'm saying today is the product of speaking, learning, teaching with a lot of different people. So people like Manuel Espinosa, Shirin Bosugia, and Miguel Zavala will hear themselves in my voice today because these are things that are not my ideas. It's stuff that has been hatched out in collaboration with other thinkers. And I want to start off with this idea that we are descendants of a corporal genocide. And that has to be maintained at the forefront of our thinking in the same way that Jewish people maintained the Holocaust during World War II as fundamental to understanding who they are and why they struggle for what they struggle, right? Now, these two books are just two that I thought make a really compelling case for us to understand what that did to us, right? And that was at a physical level, right? Bodies dying at the altars of Western civilization's notions of democracy, of Christianity, of just the notion of civilization, right? Our bodies were the human sacrifices, right? The Aztecs, if they did any, I don't know what the narrative is, right? Were nothing compared to the ones the West performed, right? But they weren't just corporal genocides, and I think that's what's most fundamentally important for us as educators working today in contemporary context to remember. We also have to talk about the cultural holocausts, how it is that it came to be that you have, again, an Indian man, at least phenotypically, speaking to you in the King's English. And that I had to master the King's English to simply be able to speak, not necessarily in a space like today, but in most conferences which are English-dominated, right? Y también les puedo hablar en español, ¿verdad? Pero el español tampoco es un idioma indígena. También es un idioma de colonización. So I'm very conflicted about, like, sometimes defending Spanish as if it was somehow defending something that is essential to me. Nothing's essential to me. Right? And that's a point I really want to highlight. Now, with regards to this notion of the cultural holocaust, before I move on from that to the role that schools have played, here's the other apology. And I guess confession, right? So maybe someone should pull out a priest for me right now. As I was putting together this talk, I kept on thinking and thinking and thinking, and I went along with the thinking, forgetting the African people's experience. And at a very logical, rational, discursive level, when I'm the scholar, I always know that. You can't talk about colonialism in the Americas without talking about the Africans. The millions of Africans that were also the victims of a genocide. Yet I did that. For about 2.5 weeks, I kept on putting this together, and as you will see in the slides, this is really the only one. And there's a deep felt problem there for me, right? Because when I'm not thinking about the things I think when I think, I commit a lot of the complicity with colonialism that I would be disgusted on if I saw it in somebody else. And I encourage all of us who are educators in urban context to always be thinking of that. In what ways do we think for the colonialists so they don't have to think against us, right? And for me, this came clear. This PowerPoint slide was inserted into my presentation last night at 4 o'clock in the morning. Okay? So again, whatever I say from up here, I'm a victim of too, and I'm perpetuating. Let me move on then to talk about the work of Joel Spring. Joel Spring, I recommend you all read him if you're urban educators. He makes a compelling case for the fact that from the very beginning, schooling was used to deculturalize people, and the different forms in which schools continue to play a role in ensuring that people are colonially dominated. I'm talking about schools today, okay? Let me go to this now, okay? So that's the past. But in the present, colonialism is alive and well. And as I started, one of the first days I sat down to put this talk together, I came across this in La Opinión. And it struck me that this was like a vivid example of the way colonialism has extended from the past into the present, right? How we are not only descendants of people who were victims of genocide, but we're also descendants of ideas and the institutions these people set into motion. This was it was the most important thing La Opinión could think of to cover that day, that Guatemala had beat Mexico in a soccer game. Right? And if any of you know what the Coliseum is like during these games, there was some fights between Mexicans and Guatemalans. Right? If you identify yourself as Mexican, as Guatemalan, as Nicaraguan, as Salvadoran, as Brazilian, you're living out colonialism. Native peoples didn't have these borders. We didn't have these discourses of space and time. And yet we live them out today. And I get depressed when the Mexican national team loses. I feel sad the rest of the day. And if they lose to the U.S., I feel even worse. Yet, on the same La Opinión, but interestingly, to a smaller extent, was this headline, "A person dead per day." And it gave you a graph of how many people have died since Operation Gatekeeper was instituted. So while we know that there was a corporal genocide that began 500 years ago and at some point resulted, according to Ward Churchill, in the death of about 90% of the native populations of what are today called as the Americas, that genocide isn't over. People continue to die at one of the institutions and discourses and ideologies of Western imperialism, which is the border. That border didn't spring out in that Sonoran desert the way a cactus does. There's nothing absolutely natural about it. So that is colonialism here and now. And although native bodies may not be dying at the same proportions, they continue to be sacrificed at the altars of Western civilization. Call it globalism, call it NAFTA, call it whatever you want to, but there is a reason that human beings have to run through the desert like lizards in search of food. Because that's what this is about, the Berlin Wall. And what is our border, right? So I wanted to highlight that as a form of talking about the fact that colonialism is alive and well here today, okay? And the genocide isn't over. Neither the cultural one nor the physical one. Our schools continue to do things, and this is what I wanted to highlight from Joel Spring's book. Joel Spring tells you that from colonial times to the present, and he gives you concrete examples. Schools have been used to deculturalize people. They continue to do it today. Wilinski writes, also talking about imperialism and educational context, right, that all you have to do is look at our history, our sense of geography, of science, of language, of literature, of the study of other peoples, to understand that we do it from a Western perspective that inferiorizes native peoples. Okay, geography, the fact that there is a geography with capitals and nation states is all Western themed. Okay? Who we read as literature and what's considered classical literature is all about the West. Okay? Obviously language. Language. Why do we have to do it in English? This is not California. This is not the United States. It's also other spaces. Okay? Yet we do it in English. That's, to me, a concrete manifestation. Every single day that I grade my students' papers and I correct their English, I'm perpetuating colonialism. Right? And I obviously am doing it with that dual mission of giving them the academic literacies to survive, but I'm still perpetuating English. And this is not an English-dominant space forever. It hasn't been forever. So, okay. At a more macro level, we could talk about the instantiation of colonialism, Miguel, if you could look at time, in terms of these propositions and the fact that right now the DREAM Act can't go through the Congress. Just think about what that's saying, what kind of a society we are, and how you can only make sense of these propositions and what's happening to the Dream Act, if you realize that a lot of what the colonialists set in motion at a discursive and ideological level is still alive today. How else could you rationalize denying a young person the ability to get an education? There is no other way. You have to understand what these people set in motion hundreds of years ago and that it hasn't died. The past is not fully past. Okay? Here's the first point I want to make. And that's that you cannot have notions of social justice and be working toward a decolonial reality if those notions of social justice don't account for everything that I've tried to highlight. We don't want access to simply be more like them. I don't think that's what we want. We don't want to just be the next batch of capitalists. We don't want to be the next batch of homophobes. We don't want to be the next batch of people that figure out how to exploit children in Pakistan making soccer balls. We don't just want access to the institutional structures that exist today. We want a different institutional structure. Because colonization doesn't look any different just because people of color perpetuate it. Condoleezza Rice, Colin Powell, right? Alberto Gonzalez, I don't think I need to go on. I think you get the point, right? Dual aims. I think anything moving toward whatever you define as decolonial has to be working for two things. The first is the development of a critical consciousness for people to read their reality so they can move toward a different world, a better world. And the next thing I think that is fundamental is that we don't forget that we have a responsibility to equip our students with the academic literacies so schools will not deny them the opportunity to go on. Okay? And we can't let go of either one of these tasks. It's a difficult balancing act, but we have to figure out how to do that. It does us no good to have intensely critical thinkers out there if they're standing on a corner unable to feed themselves. Okay, this is what it looked for us in a program we did at UCLA. I'm not going to talk about it because I know the time is going. But it's the ability to bring these two dual aims together and to function simultaneously. The role of praxis. Okay, working on Freirean pedagogy, I think it's fundamentally important that we understand that the way we arrive at constructing a new reality is by acting in the world and constantly reflecting on our action in the world, to measure it, to see where it's taking us. And this is in an ongoing conversation that I'm having with Shiriko Suji right now about the problematics that we critical educators, or decolonizing is which is what we call ourselves, educators sometimes fall into. And that's thinking that we have the answers for what our students' better worlds need to look like already. And we don't. And we shouldn't. While we know that we want a better world and we want to share that with them, I think it's really highly problematic that we forget that the new reality, that a decolonial reality is going to be constructed in the process. That it's the process and not the product. I follow this logic of praxis as the process through which we arrive at that different decolonial world. Right? And I think it's important because it keeps us honest. And it moves us away from becoming prophets to remembering that we're pedagogues. I don't want to be a prophet and tell kids this is what the world has to look like and this is what you need to die for. I don't know what they need to die for. I don't live in their bodies. I haven't lived their experiences. So that the best I think is I can construct with them an understanding of what a better world would look like, that we would both, or all millions of us, would want to live in. Right? And it's a problem that I keep finding recurrently in these traditions of critical pedagogies, decolonizing, whatever. We all tend to fall into that again. I start with myself. So again, for me, the way we move away from this is praxis. To always reflect on what it is that you're doing when you're in pedagogical spaces, and to remember that you don't know already which way we're moving. We're moving without fully, consciously knowing what is that future going to look like. It has to be constructed. Here's the other thing that I think is fundamentally necessary, given a lot of the things I've been mentioning about how we don't all come from one colonial experience and we don't live colonialism in the same way. And that's the need to work from a theoretical heteroglossia. This is building off Mikhail Bakhtin's work. Mikhail Bakhtin was basically arguing that language in all social spaces have two forces that are moving in opposite directions. One force is trying to to make language be unified so that we can have common meanings and understand, so people can talk and understand each other. The other force, which he refers to as centrifugal, is a force that's always diversifying language. It's always taking language in different directions. I borrow that notion to talk about a theoretical heteroglossia. And that the notion here is that while we have a unifying force in our thinking, which is we're working toward a decolonial reality, that's what unifies things for us. We have to be able to move from all kinds of traditions. Okay, I mentioned earlier that I'm no longer Catholic. And that's because lighting candles to vírgenes and saints didn't make sense to me anymore. Right? And I don't think we should light candles to any particular theoretical traditions or schools of thought either. They're tools, they're instruments that we use. Some of these theories don't coalesce with each other. But depending on where you're standing in the world, when you're trying to make sense of how colonialism works, they work. So you have to be able, I would argue, to work from different theories that wouldn't necessarily fit into the theoretical orientation of a dissertation in a coherent way, but that do give you coherent ways of reading different realities that people live in the real world. So the argument is for something along the lines of a multi-voiced theoretical perspective. And this is, I think, a better idea of what it would look like. If you're looking at it and trying to make sense of the different ways in which colonialism plays itself out, you need a wide diversity of theoretical perspectives, all moving at the same time, unified with the goal of trying to understand and work toward a decolonial reality. And then the final point, Miguel, do I have 2 minutes? Okay. The final point I want to make today, and I think I've been making it from the beginning because I was guilty of it at the very beginning, is that we don't forget that we, every single one of us, is complicit in the operation of colonialism. It's not something out there that's working against us. It works against us and it works through us. If you own a mortgage or you're thinking about buying a house someday, that's a Western logic of owning property and owning land to the exclusion of others. Okay? If you teach English, even if you're doing it toward academic literacies, you have to really think about how you're doing it. If you call yourself a person who's a citizen of any country, you're living out colonialism. I don't need to go into all the different ways that race and gender work through us, because I think you all know those deep, dark, problematic thoughts that you have about others that you don't share because you know politically it's the wrong thing to think, but we still end up thinking it. We're not immune to it. And you have to remember that on a daily basis when you're dealing with other human beings in pedagogical spaces. And you have to be willing to accept that you make these mistakes. Because colonialism would not live if it wasn't living through real living people who make it real every day. It's not out there. It's in here. It's in here. Right? That's the final point I wanted to make. Thank you very much.